started because this is Impact 75 minutes. And we welcome everybody who may be watching this recording later. This is February 7th, 2022, when Congregational Church Impact 75. Today is the second in a series of 75-minute conversations, professionally resourced, to address issues that pastors at Winnetka Congregational Church are hearing from our members about everyday issues that are important to them. They would seek some guidance about. And today's topic is dementia care, the individual, the family, and the church. Let me tell you a little bit about our presenter tonight. She is Angela Roberts, Assistant Professor of Communication, Sciences, and Disorders in the School of Communication, Northwestern University. Her interests are in age-related language and cognition changes and acquired cognitive communication disorders in adults with neurodegenerative disorders. Her research includes the neurological and behavioral characterization of language and communication profiles in these populations, in addition to the design and evaluation of therapy interventions and caregiver education programs. Her research is informed by a 25-year clinical career as a speech-language pathologist. Angela received her Ph.D. in Health and Rehabilitation Science from the University of Western Ontario and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in Cognitive Neurology at the Lawson Health Research Institutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me for this conversation tonight. It's lovely to be here with all of you. I do have some slides to show. So it's probably something I don't have to point out to this audience, but I think it's always worth highlighting is that Alzheimer's dementia and what we now call related dementias, which are really any dementia of various causes. And there's roughly, at last count, about 32 different dementia types that come from different pathologies, different protein misfoldings in the brain. But when we put all of those together, what we truly are facing is one of the largest health crises that the world has ever seen. Currently, there's about 48 million people living in the world with dementia. We expect by the year 2050 that will go up to 115 million. And those are very conservative estimates. In the US alone, about 1 in every 5 people over the age of 65, we think will have dementia by the year 2050 or 2060. So these are rapidly rising numbers that are something that we have to think about as a society. In fact, the World Health Organization has actually declared the next 10 years the decade on aging, not just from the perspective of dementia care, but also from the perspective of helping people age better and helping people age with wellness. Because we are, if you look at the numbers around the world, there's this, you can't see my hands perhaps, but there's this flat curve for people 15 and under that just remains flat till the year 2070. But for people 65 and older, that curve is just continuing to rise. And so around the world, it matters not where you are. We are fastly becoming an aging society. And that raises to the kind of forefront conditions such as dementia, which happen more often in older adults. One of the things I think is particularly important for the church, and I know my own church has been thinking about this, is how do we take aging and dementia care into our worldwide ministries? And that's because particular countries that will be really affected over the next 20 to 30 years are those that actually have very low income and very low GDP. So countries like Latin America, Africa, and the indigenous peoples, First Nations communities around the world will see almost a 50 to 60% steep rise in increase in dementia cases. So I kind of raise this not because it's the center of what we're talking about tonight, but dementia is certainly the center of what we talk about tonight. And I want to just kind of give some context for that. You can go ahead. Thank you. Then you can, yeah. So tonight I'm going to kind of, I hope with time, I've got my timer set, touch on 4 points. Caregiving, connecting, communication, and community. Community being the community that we all live in, but also the very important community, meaning our church and our faith communities, and how there are opportunities to support people and families living with dementia. I'm going to start with caregiving. So this is one of the slides that we don't know where it went, but we'll start with this one. The first thing I want to talk a little bit about is that caregiving, and we use the term caregiving versus caregiver. You'll see me interchange out of those for a few reasons. And in a couple of slides, I hope, if it's still there, we'll talk about the fact that caregivers and the identity of who someone is as a caregiver versus a family member, it's actually something that changes on a day-by-day basis. So it's not a static entity. So we like to use the term caregiving versus defining everyone who provides care as a caregiver. Caregiving activities are complex. We often think about this kind of large overarching, if it's the toileting and the dressing and the feeding of someone, but it's much more nuanced than that. Caregiving also includes taking care of someone's emotional needs, supporting things like transportation or managing a loved one's emotional state, attending to medical appointments, shopping. And so when we think about all the entities that obligate kind of care, it's a huge amount of time in someone's lives. I don't know how many of you are actually caregivers. I am and have been twice now. I cared for my grandmother who died of vascular cognitive impairment, which is now the second most common form of cognitive impairment in the world. And I now provide care for my uncle who has primary progressive aphasia. So this is not only the work that I do, it is part of my everyday life. And I can say outside of my full-time job, all of these things are an obligation in my life. So caregiver stress can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be social. And by that, we mean that caregiving can actually take away from the other social activities that you might normally do. And signs and symptoms, many of you who are caring will be able to relate to this, but it's feeling overwhelmed, sometimes feeling isolated or alone. It can also lead to health changes, such as weight changes, increased perceptions of anger, being worried, and being sad. So there's negative aspects of caregiving, and these are the ones that are so kind of in our face all the time. I apologize, this slide isn't colored very well for being able to view it. But there's the financial burden, sleep issues, caregivers, whether we're talking about caregivers of people who have dementia or caregivers of people who have had stroke, for example, actually increase the likelihood of heart disease by almost 50 to 60%. So there's real physical health consequences of caregiving, both because we neglect our issues, our own health issues, but also there's a tremendous physiological stress in providing care for another human, aside from the emotional and kind of psychological stress. But there are also, thanks, you're fine. There's also positive aspects of caregiving. And in fact, around 73% of all caregivers will endorse at least one positive component of caregiving. So it's not all negative. Caregivers often describe personal growth and a sense of accomplishment, a sense of being able to give back to a loved one. That was the case for me and my grandmother. The opportunity to care for her in the way she had cared for me as a child was one of the most remarkable moments in my life. There are opportunities to develop positive relationships, and we're going to talk about those today, how we think about communication and connecting as a way of creating positive relationships with the person that we're providing care for. And so I want to keep us kind of centered on this framework of it's not just the negative. You can go ahead. There was a lovely picture here, but it really is about balancing the positive. No, it's just 2 words. It's about thinking, how do we balance the positive and negative aspects of providing care? Go ahead. So a healthy caregiver provides better care. I'd love to say that I'm an example of this. I'm not. But I hope you all leave here tonight with an example of how to be a healthy caregiver. And from my area of research, we're not just thinking about healthy caregivers as people who exercise and move, but healthy caregivers, particularly in my area of research, healthy caregivers emotionally from still having a preserved relationship with a person who has dementia and a lowered sense of social isolation and loneliness in the context of providing care. So, and you can hit one, just hit once more. Mm-hmm. Perfect. So it's like magic. So these are a list of self-care tips that are actually provided by the U.S. government's Office on Women's Health. Yes, there actually is one of those. But the two ones at the bottom are really the ones that are centered in my research. So reducing loneliness by finding ways of connecting with the person who has dementia, and maintaining and creating new social connections, both for yourself, but also as a dyad between you and the person you're providing care for. Thank you. So I want to clarify a couple of terms here that are probably relevant to the work that we do. Social isolation and loneliness are not the same thing. So social isolation is this kind of notion of objectively how many people are in your circle. But we can feel loneliness even when there's a lot of people in our circle. And loneliness is the subjective. It's the gap between your desired and actual social contact, right? So if you don't necessarily need a lot of people around you, you may not feel lonely with only having 2 close friends. But the kind of point that we draw out of this research when we're trying to understand social isolation and loneliness, loneliness is a contributor to depression in older adults. Loneliness is a contributor to poor health outcomes in caregivers. And loneliness in and of itself has an increased risk of developing dementia, not social isolation. So we can actually separate these two entities in the research. Meaningful social interactions mitigate loneliness, not just having more people. And so part of where I think our churches and our communities have a real opportunity is to give the chance to have these meaningful relationships as we're providing care. Go ahead. Thank you. I feel like I need to do my Vanna White thing. Dementia caregivers are at an increased risk of both social isolation and loneliness. In fact, a little over 40% of all caregivers of persons with dementia endorse at least moderate loneliness severity. And this is something that did not necessarily exist prior to caring for someone with dementia. It actually is a component of being more isolated, but also having this sense of disconnection from the person that you're providing care to, if that's a parent or a spouse or even a friend. The LGBT community is one community in particular that has an increased risk for loneliness. And in fact, the number in that community is upwards of 70% of those caregivers endorse the sensation of feeling lonely. They're particularly isolated in their journey of providing care. And so I highlight this to kind of give us this balance that even amongst the experience of caregiving, there are different groups who may have more or less experience, more or less aspects of being isolated from others and being disconnected from others. Thank you. So the model that we sometimes use when we're thinking about care here, and I'll kind of frame all the things that I'll talk about tonight in this model. And this isn't to give you some academic lecture, but it's to say we kind of do think about these things a bit. And the model that we use is this kind of ecological systems perspective. It's a big fancy word for saying that the experience of living with dementia, whether you're a person with dementia or you're a care partner, is not just limited to the diagnosis itself, your clinical symptoms, the biology of what's happening. That the experience of living with dementia exists also in this nature of your family and social relationships, your coping skills, your response to the illness and injury itself. And there's a reason why each of these circles are of equal size. They're of equal size because everyone's experience of living with dementia is completely different. Even if you have the same number of misfolded proteins, you have the same amount of brain cells that perhaps are not working properly, the experience of living with dementia differs incredibly based on these other two components, the kind of psychological aspects and the social aspects of living with dementia. Now, the other reason why we like to think about these models is I may not can change the diagnosis. There are certainly very limited medications and treatments for changing the underlying biology or pathology of the dementia. But what we can often change are these other components. We can create support systems. We can teach people how to cope and live differently with dementia. We can change the family system's reaction to living with dementia. And so we highlight this because it's important to realize that of all the things we cannot change, there are many things that we can change to improve both providing care and living with these conditions. So part of this is learning to think about, and I use the term family here very, very broadly, family being the biological people who are in your care circle, but family also being the community, your faith community, your neighbors, those people who are part of your caregiving journey. And indeed, from a research perspective, we think about it that way. There's a couple of things I want to highlight from this slide. When someone has communication difficulties, when they have difficulty finding words, difficulty putting their thoughts together, difficulty remembering what they want to say, it affects everyone in the family unit. We often think about this, if you'll remember, like a child's mobile that used to hang over their crib. When you move one part of it, everything about the mobile moves. Dementia does that, right? It not only affects the person they're living with, but everyone who's in that circle. So what that means is when we're thinking about changing things, we need to change this broad circle of people who are connected. Someone having dementia affects a church. Someone having dementia affects your neighborhood, right? And we're going to talk about tonight how we kind of deal with that as a family unit. The other thing I want to point out here is that roles and relationships change, not just for the person who has dementia, but for everyone who's in that community of care. So I'll talk a little bit about this because it does get into when we're thinking about activities or communication strategies. And so there's a real reason for kind of walking you through what seems like this kind of academic structure of what is a family in the context of caregiving. Because when we get ready to start thinking about how we adjust communication and the strategies that we put into place, it's important to remember that we're not just giving those strategies to, for example, someone's partner who may be the person they live with all the time, but we do actually need to educate everyone around. And so this is one of the fantastic reasons for being here tonight. This is an opportunity for me to help you change your congregation as a whole in terms of how you interact with and engage with people who have dementia. So this notion of caregiver identity is something that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, which is at any one point in time, caregivers are positioned more as a family member or more as a caregiver. So this is a fluid identity. And those of you who are providing care can identify to this, that there's some days you really feel like someone's spouse, someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's aunt, someone's niece. And there's other days you just feel like you're the personal support worker who's been hired to do the job for the day, right? And that constantly changing emotional space is something that has to be thought about in the context of caregiving because it very much affects how we interact and how we communicate with the person that we're providing care for. I'll give you an example from my own life. I've told you this is a very legitimate space for me. This is now the second person I've provided care for. And with my grandmother, there were days where meeting all of her basic activities of daily living, I had to put on my caregiver hat to get through that day. Right? It was just all I could do to hold down my job, take care of my family, and take care of her. But there were days where all I wanted was to put my head in her lap and have her stroke my hair again the way my grandmother would. And I did that. And so this ability to kind of think about what are the transactional communication moments, the communication that I have to do to just get the job done. And the interactional space where I could care not whether she remembered what day it was, whether she could articulate her thoughts. I only cared that when my head was in her lap, she knew it was me. And her automatic behaviors, whether to stroke my head or rub my back, made my work day go away. All the uglies, all the terribles. And no matter how advanced she got into her dementia, up until really the last week of her death, she knew how to change those roles. I also knew when she needed me to be her granddaughter, and I knew when she needed me to be her caregiver. So this notion of fluid space is incredibly important for us to become in tune with, because it does very much affect our expectations around communication in any moment, right? And so this is why I kind of spend time explaining this. This is not my theory. This is actually something we well know from the caregiving space that these roles are there. So now we're going to kind of start moving into what is really my space, which is how language and communication changes in the context of dementia affect this. And we know that these are some studies that have been around for a long time now, but loss of language and communication is actually more distressing to most caregivers than doing things like basic activities of daily living. We know, for example, that one of the top reasons that will land someone in a long-term care facility or in supervised care is difficulty communicating, not needing help toileting, not needing help with feeding, not needing help with dressing. There's a reason for that, right? We often talk about the fact that talk is at the center of family life. Talk is at the center of our relationships. And when it erodes, we lose this kind of notion of connection with others. And so a lot of our work is centered on how we try to make this better. Okay. I'll highlight just one study that we just recently completed. So this was in primary progressive aphasia. Interestingly, the research was done before my uncle was diagnosed. There's a rather strange irony to all of this. But we looked at what was the relationship between conversation difficulties and the experience of caregiving burden. So interestingly enough, so primary progressive aphasia, for those of you who know or may not know, is a form of dementia that affects people typically when they're younger, in their 50s and 60s, although the onset can be in the 70s, but it does typically affect younger people. And it decimates the language system. So it does not affect their memory until much later in the disease. It's not like Alzheimer's dementia. But what it does is robs people of their ability to put together words or put words into sentences. And so oftentimes within 6 or 7 years of their diagnosis, they lose the ability to communicate altogether, even though many of them can still understand what's happening in the world around them. It's a particularly devastating form of dementia. So we looked at kind of the relationship between these conversation difficulties and caregiving burden, and we found that it was significant, hugely significant. So the smaller those numbers, the bigger the effect. What we saw was that it affected not only objective burden, which is that measure of how much work you're having to do to take care of activities of daily living and toileting and dressing, but also subjective stress burden, your feelings of distress, anxiety, depression in association with caregiving. And interestingly enough, we've seen the exact same thing in Alzheimer's dementia. So 2 studies have been done in this area, both of them ours. And both of them convey this very important piece. If we can take care of some of the communication problems, we can actually lessen some of the impact of burden in caregiving. Go ahead. Okay, so any questions on caregiving before I move forward? So I have these little pause slides built in so we can take any questions, just so you make sure I'm not talking too fast or there's things I've gone over that you have questions about. If not, we can kind of keep going on.
Quick question, Angela, that slide where you had various symptoms, I think you might call it, I would call it aphasia being the highlighted one. It's at 24%. Is that 24% of cases? Or
so that's 20, and thank you. I didn't probably explain that slide very well. That's 24% of caregivers state that their top priority are some of the language and communication challenges. Yeah. Yeah. So as opposed to your own personal care needs or the need for supervision, and this highlights just the importance of these kind of aphasia or language and communication challenges. Even more important to caregivers than memory loss. What's interesting, and as a kind of back note on this, when recent studies, so this is an older one, more recent studies have not shown anything different. Language and communication issues are still a top priority for caregivers. But a recent study looked at several thousand people across clinics in the United States, and 83% of the survey respondents, and I can't remember now how many, was in excess of 2,000 or 2,500 people, 83% of care partners of people living with dementia said the one piece of information that they needed more of, that nobody ever talks to them about, are the language and communication challenges. So not only is it the top symptom that's bothersome to care partners, but it is also the one area that you get, and we get very little information on when we go for our annual appointments, right? And kind of get information from the doctor's office. All right, any other questions? Thank you for that question. And thanks for asking me to clarify. Okay, I'll scoot us along then. Okay, so we're going to talk about connecting next, and I've got some cool videos in here. I hope they work. We'll see if the links are working. So you can go ahead. So there was a great picture in here too, but we'll just go with this quote, which is communicating through conversation is the single most important mechanism that we as humans use for maintaining and creating meaningful social connections. Now, this is not my statement. This is actually something we know well from evolutionary science. One of the things that we uniquely do as humans is have a conversation. Language, even the complexity of it, is something that we uniquely do. The definition of a conversation is not what you think it is. It's not necessarily this kind of transactional piece of two humans exchanging information. The very definition of conversation, as linguists and evolutionary scientists use it, is exactly this, that it is the single mechanism that we as humans use to connect to one another. It's why I keep making this point, and I sound like a broken record, but I think it is worth emphasizing that when it is gone, when we lose it, it's not just making life harder. It actually is the very destruction of our connection to others. It's something to think about for us as caregivers, but it's also something for generating empathy for people who are living with these conditions, right? Who are also losing some of those connections around them. And it is my huge advocacy for being their voice to say our job is to create opportunities that allow them to connect to others with the abilities that they have. Okay, what is this? Okay, so this is another slide that just talks a little bit about this construct and this comes out of some theories from Kitwood in the 1990s, old social work theories, Ellen Ryan's work, that talks about the interconnectedness of all human beings, right? So this notion of what we're going to talk about here over the next few slides, which is how do we make meaningful connections? How do we create opportunities for those connections to come together in the context of dementia care? The other thing that I will point out here is that care partners, and we truly kind of believe this is our primary role, and we see this in our research, which is the real role of care partners is to act as facilitators, right? Not substitute communicators, but facilitators for the persons who have dementia. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we set this up for success here. And these are some principles that come out of, again, older theories from Kitwood's work and others that still stand the test of time, which is our primary job is to help preserve the personhood and the dignity of people living with dementia. And this has been a real change over the last 20 years. 20 years ago or so when I started this work in earnest, it was a-okay for people just to make decisions for persons with dementia and not take into account their input at all. In fact, that happened a lot. And now you're seeing a huge move even across medical schools to train physicians how to engage people with cognitive impairment, those who have dementia, in their own decision making. With full awareness that that's a supported decision making, but there's no longer the attempt to just overlook that person, to rob their dignity and to take them of their personhood. And you might say, well, gosh, what's the most important part of that? Well, beyond the fact that we don't want to rob anyone of their dignity, there's also a behavioral reason why we don't want that to happen. Needs-driven behavior. So a lot of you will be familiar with, you know, people saying that persons with dementia can have outbursts and have behaviors that are difficult to manage. Some people with dementia do. One of the interesting pieces that we've been discovering over the last decade or so is that those behaviors are not just manifestations of the dementia and the brain changes, but they are in part a manifestation of what we call needs-driven behaviors, which is there's an inherent need, and the response to that need that is going unmet is the behavior. It's the outburst, the refusal, the ignoring, the withdrawing, the shouting, the screaming, all of those things that can make living with someone who has dementia more challenging. One of the needs that is coming to light of recent years is that this notion of someone not having their personhood, not having their dignity, not having their rights respected is one of those needs that drives those behaviors. And so this is more than just the respect for all humans. It's more than just that kind of that global sense. It really is the fact that in thinking about this, we can take care of some of the more challenging symptoms of living with someone who has dementia. There are a couple of ways that we try to encourage family members to think on this front. The first is negotiating preferences, and the second is kind of facilitating participation. And so what this means is whether we're talking about someone with early cognitive changes who's just been diagnosed, or someone who's in the more advanced stages of the disease, that within their ability, we offer opportunities to have them negotiate their preferences, even if that is something as simple as holding out two objects and following their eye gaze to which one they look at. In early stage dementia, that may be actually negotiating their true preferences. When you have trouble finding a word, do you want me to fill it in for you? Would you like me to give you choices? Or would you like to try to get that word out until you give me the hand signal that you need help? Right? These are overt decisions of kind of thinking about at all stages of dementia how we engage someone in their preferences. Facilitating participation is what we do to help build ramps, if you like, to success for people who have dementia. And that can involve everything from ensuring that social conversations take place in smaller groups that are less challenging for people who have dementia, or actually doing something that actually creates room in a conversation. If you know someone is having trouble getting their words out or following the pace of a conversation, you can act as a ramp to say, you know, John made this interesting comment last week about the situation in the Ukraine. John, you were talking about your frustration with whatever it is, right? You're actually building out a place in that conversation for John to come in. And then as he formulates his thoughts, he can step in, even if it's contributing one or two lines, right? So it's this constant negotiation of thinking of ourselves as your partner. You'll find I'll use John a lot today because that's my uncle's name. So he's at my house currently. And I facilitate for him a lot in conversations. He has PPA, as I said, he has extreme difficulty finding his words. He gets very frustrated. And we have cues. He raises his finger when he's done trying, and that's my cue to step in and help him. But we've negotiated that as his preference. That'll change in 6 months, but for today, that's his preference. So other things are to think about being in tune with yourself and your partner. This means choosing times of the day carefully, around medication, fatigue. It is a-okay to not have the day filled with 1,000 activities. In fact, we run a couple of clinical trials for people who are living with dementia, one in primary progressive aphasia and one in Alzheimer's disease. And the two things that our participants are always saying to us is, my partner tries to fill my day with too much stuff, right? Sometimes I just need quiet. Sometimes I just need to step back. We have people who will refuse to go to family events, not because they don't want to be with family, but because there's too much noise and too much chaos. And an easy way to take care of that is ensure that wherever you're going, there's actually a quiet room for that person to get away to when they need to decompress. We worked with a family recently that wanted to take this huge family vacation. And they wanted to do that because they were afraid that the person with dementia was continuing to fail. And they wanted this last family event. And the person that we were working with who had dementia was absolutely refusing to go. And it was causing this huge distress between he and his partner. His daughter was angry. She was hurt by this, truly hurt. So what we talked them into was just doing a vacation rental where he could have a little cottage out to the side that he could get away to when he needed to, when he just needed to decompress. And we worked with this entire family to understand what that rule was for him. And then we got him to go. And it was fantastically successful. But it took almost 4 months of convincing him because of this repeated experience he had had of going to these events and just being overwhelmed. So it's about being smart at kind of each one of these spaces so that when we need to make meaningful connections, we have the opportunity to do so in a way that works for us, but in a way that also understands the limitations and challenges of being a person who has dementia. We talk about this last point a lot, and I'm going to raise it here because it is super important that we check in on what our own intentions are when we go to communicate with someone who has dementia. Are we trying to get something done? Are we just trying to make that meaningful connection, as I described with my grandmother? But the one thing we have to always remember is that communication is never about testing. If there's kind of one thing I would ask you to take away from our time, our conversation together tonight is that communication is about connecting. It's not about testing. There is nothing that you're going to do in a conversation that is going to make the dementia go away. There's nothing you're going to do in a conversation that is going to slow the progression or decline of the brain disease. But what you have the opportunity to do is to preserve the relationship in front of you. So sitting down with someone and asking them about the 32 things they did when they were 13 just does not matter. Asking them to recall today's date does not matter. Acknowledging where they are, meeting them in the space where they are right now is what matters. So it's that important piece of remembering that when you sit down to have a conversation with someone who has dementia, it's not therapy. It is just that, it's just connecting. Okay, so we're going to set up for success in a couple of other ways. And these are just, I will say, just like my helpful tips, so I have to lay them out there. Minimize environmental distractions, turn off radios, TVs. Do not try to have a conversation in 2 different rooms. It doesn't work particularly well. And really try to resist talking while walking away. I am the worst at this, and it's my job to be good at this, but I am the worst at being super busy and just turning my back and walking out of a room while what I'm saying is trailing off. It doesn't work well. Both because of the potential for hearing issues, but also because people with dementia need to hear and see what you're saying. So they need you to be face to face. They need you to be about 4 to 6 feet apart from them. They need to see your facial expressions, watch your mouth move, hear very clearly what you're saying. All of those inputs will help them to follow the conversation better. The other thing it does is people with dementia learn to depend on facial expressions and emotions as much as they do the words. And so if you're walking away, we've just robbed them of an important channel for them to follow and understand what you need and want. Go ahead. Thank you. This again, I think had pictures on it, but here we go. Make sure that you have glasses and hearing aids on, and gather all of your supplies. And by that, I mean every room should have some Sharpies, some index cards, and some pieces of paper, right? Just put them in every room. And the reason why is if someone's having trouble following what you said, and I don't know about you, but the number of times in my house people say, huh, what, I didn't get you, or they just walk away and ignore you because they didn't understand. Sharpies and index cards, blank pieces of paper are your way to quickly write out what you said or clarify a word. And again, this notion of kind of multiple modalities of input, whether it's listening, hearing, and then maybe actually even seeing the words. So certainly from moderate stages of dementia on, it's super important that you just have your kit in every room. So why a Sharpie? They're nice and thick and black, easy to see. You could also use a dry erase board. And there's no point in you going to the kitchen, because by the time you go to the kitchen to get your supplies and come back to the room, the moment's already gone. So just put something in each room that you can use. Sorry, nice thing to read my mind. Other kind of tips for setting up for success for activities include being emotionally present. So it is really tough to have a conversation with somebody who has dementia if your mind is half on other things. Why? Because they know. So keep in mind that while language and being able to follow language may be more challenging for people with dementia, they are much more in tune to other things like your body language. They will pick it up on a dime that you're not present and you're not there. And the moment will either go poorly or they will misinterpret it. It will cause them frustration and you may get one of those reactive behaviors. So you just kind of have to tune yourself in. Again, we teach family members how to do this. As much as I teach it, I also know it's really hard. And there are days I have to take a big breath before I walk into my uncle's room to get them ready to go for the day and just say, okay, I've got to be all 100% here. Right. And that is one of the most challenging things to do when you've got so many other things going on. You have to really kind of watch that notion of being rushed or impatient. And most importantly, you have to let go of your expectations, right? Communication is just as good as it is in any moment. You have to let go of your expectations of what you think it should be. We've talked a little bit about this, but just it's important to kind of monitoring your nonverbal gestures carefully. Okay, so, you know, one of the best ways, and one of the things that people often say to me is, it's great that you've given me all these conversation strategies, but what the heck do we have a conversation about? Right, and so one of the things that we try to make sure that people are aware of is you have to, especially as we get to, not so much in the early stages of dementia, but more in the moderate to later stages of dementia, it's incredibly important to kind of orchestrate these opportunities for conversations to happen. That they can certainly happen over the morning paper, if you like. They can happen over a news broadcast if that's your typical habit and pattern. But the problem is then you have the television as a distraction. But at least once or twice a day, these kind of engaging activities or meaningful activities can be both cognitively stimulating as well as give fantastic opportunities to connect with the other person. And you can do this over music or art, books and games. It doesn't really matter the source, but it matters how we do it. And so it's important to remember these should be activities that are completed jointly. So between you and the person, or even better, friends and family who come by to help support. You want to kind of think about co-constructing the activity by modeling and showing. So it does very little good to tell somebody with dementia how to do something. It does wonderful good if you will actually show them by doing. In fact, we often will say, don't talk so much, but actually sit down if you want someone to do an activity like folding napkins and fold the first 2 or 3 for them and just let them watch you. And then pass over and help them do the same activity. The less you talk and the more you show, the easier it is for them. And thinking about how to break activities down into manageable segments. So the same activity, and we'll talk a little bit about how we've done this with some of our families. here in just a moment, and this kind of always kind of guidance of avoiding testing behaviors. But these are really kind of the rules for how an activity can go well. In our work, we believe it's really important. This is where we think about that expanded family construct. We believe it is super important that grandkids learn how to do this, neighbors learn how to do this, friends and family learn how to do this. And when we teach families how to have these meaningful activities, if you go to the next slide.
Montessori activities follow a set of principles. And of course, one of the main principles is that the activity needs, or the role needs to be meaningful to the person. So it has to have a link back to who the person is.
I brought a song by the Beatles, who used to be one of your favorites. And also a song by Dean Martin. Which one would you like to listen to? Excellent.
It's really important that people are given an invitation to participate. It's about honouring them as adults and allowing them some control over their lives. And often they lose that sense of control because of their dementia.
Yes, and I wondered if you could help me with a couple of things. So I brought two things. I brought some flowers and
sorry, this is almost as bad as when I'm teaching the classroom, so I'm sorry. One of the things I want you to notice that she did beautifully well there was, and did anyone catch it? What does she do when she, yeah, exactly. So she goes to turn her head to make sure she's at eye contact. She's sitting right beside him or across from him, but she's not at all ever talking underneath. She's getting right down to make sure she has his eye contact before she starts. It's an incredibly important component of engaging someone with dementia, but also from a communication standpoint and from a personhood standpoint, right? When we look each other in the eyes, it shows that we're respecting the other person's dignity, and that's an important component. Go ahead.
also some pictures of birds. What would you like to do? Look at the pictures or maybe the flowers?
Offering choice is important because it gives them some control and enables them to participate in just what activity they're going to do. Talking less and demonstrating more is really important because the motor activity or demonstrating means that they're not trying to focus on what you're saying as well as what you are doing. So demonstrating is one of the key principles. It's really important to know what somebody's strengths are and to use those strengths. And, you know, certainly when it comes to physical abilities, we can use those and be mindful of those when we develop activities for them. It's about being aware of how quickly somebody moves, how quickly do they feed themselves or walk or raise their head when you're talking to them. So we need to match their level of speed. Well, cues and templates are important because they can guide the person so that they know what they need to do. For example, setting the table using a template. A template will show them where the things go. The answer is there for them. Enabling the person to hold something helps them to focus on the activity. It's important to work from simple through to complex. As somebody is able to do the simplest version of the activity, then we can change it to make it a little more difficult. So you always work from simple through to complex. An activity may be start off with them just doing the one step over and over again until they get that step, and then you add another step in. And so you build on an activity step by step. It's important to ask the person if they actually enjoyed what they've just done and if they would like to do it again. That guides you and lets you know that they've enjoyed it, and for the person, it again gives them a sense of some control.
Did you enjoy doing that?
Yeah.
Yes. Can I come back another time and we'll do this again?
We can do it again.
There is no right or wrong with a Montessori activity. The right way is the person's way.
So a couple of other things to notice that they do really well there. And again, we use, even in our own work, we use these Montessori methods, and Montessori methods have become quite well accepted for working with persons who have dementia. And so this notion of even asking at the end whether or not someone liked the activity is a way of engaging their personhood and respecting them, right? So it's not just a check-in of, gosh, did you like this? Do you want to do it again? That very act, if I want to know, if I want to respect you, I'm going to ask whether or not you liked doing something. Did you enjoy going to the movie with me? How do you like your dinner tonight? It's a common decency that when we are interacting with persons with dementia, that often lifts out of the equation because they're not able to reciprocate in the same way as we're used to with other people who are communicating with us. And so this video you'll have access to, and there's a whole, I try to provide a lot of references and resources in this slide deck that you guys can go home and kind of spend some time on your own. But there's a whole series in this kind of Montessori series from Cameron Camp's group that you can go through and watch several videos. Again, one other piece I want to point out here is this isn't just about doing activities to keep people busy. These are activities that give opportunities for communicating, right? Opportunities for connecting. This is in the context of dementia, how we connect. Sometimes is to orchestrate these activities. You can go on. Thank you. So this was actually pictures of something that we use in our research and in my lab that didn't show up here, but I want to talk to you about them a little bit. We have people build what we call communication boxes that build on this Montessori approach. And what they are boxes that are filled with tangible things, things you can touch, things you can listen to. So there might be a record in there. There might be, we had one family who, the woman we were working with had early onset Alzheimer's dementia. She was in her 60s when she was diagnosed. Always every year made Christmas tarts by her mother's recipe, lost the ability to do that. We were able to get her back one Christmas where she, again, using these Montessori methods, could contribute with her sisters to making these tarts. So that year, we actually shellacked one of them and it went into her memory box, right? So she could touch it and feel it and hold it. So that tactile piece, that ability to pick things up and manipulate them is very important for people who have dementia. But these boxes, and I wish you could see the pictures of them because they're ones that our families have created over time, are actually themed. So there might be one about baking, there might be one about a family vacation, there might be one about a grandchild's memory. But what we actually encourage family members to do is to have everyone in the family create a box that's for them and the person who has dementia. And so some of our families have 15 to 20 of these small themed boxes, and they change them out every week. So they might put a new box out every week that becomes the source of conversations in the home that week, where the person with dementia can actually go get it and open it and take things out of it. And we consider that taking things out as a conversation starter, right? It's not that, hey, I want to talk about baking at Christmas. But when she takes out that tart, it's her initiation. It's respecting how she's trying to start a conversation. It's different, but it's just as effective. And so then our families will change these out, get new things to talk about. The difference for our families is huge because one of the big barriers toward having people come in to engage with people who have dementia is they no longer can find things to talk about. It's really tough for people. So family members start to pull back, friends start to pull back because they just don't know what to do and they don't know what to talk about. These give opportunities for people to have things to talk about. So the other set of pictures up there was a family of ours where they got 23 of these one Christmas. Everybody in the family made one and sent them in, and everybody had their own. And so when people would come to visit, they had their box that they talked to this person with, right? So these are real ways to kind of think about, if you just want to sit down and talk about the weather, it's not going to go very well. But if you want to create meaningful activities and meaningful opportunities to have conversations, there's lots of ways to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about how we've adapted some of these activities. So what you just saw kind of in the Montessori video was this notion of clearly people who were a bit more advanced in their dementia stages. I want to walk you through a couple of examples around how we apply these principles in early, middle, and late stage dementia. In early stage dementia, this is a banking activity. There's a picture of banking up there. Imagine it in your head. And so in early stage dementia, where someone was just starting, was still able to do all their own banking, but perhaps just needed a little bit of support. But it was also important for the spouse to learn what were the banking passwords, right? Eventually this was going to be challenging for this person. We actually helped them develop a program where they could actually, the spouse took on the role of learning from the person who had dementia. So the person with dementia would write down their passwords, created this whole book around how to get into all their banking accounts. And it became a teaching role where the person with dementia got to teach his spouse about their banking. In the middle stages within the same family, the spouse then assumed the banking role, but still allowed the person to be engaged in the activity by helping them sort the bills, got a paid stamp so that they could stamp each one of the bills when she paid them. So again, he could still be engaged in the process. His dignity wasn't taken away, but what he could do in the process just was changed. And then by the late stage in dementia, he was no longer able to really engage in the process, but what he could do was just sit and watch and maybe hold some of the bills while she paid them. But there was never a stage from the beginning until the end of his days living with dementia. And this took about 6, almost 7 years, that he was not actively engaged in the single most important role that he played in his family, which was their financial management. He just did it differently, right? And so this is how we kind of think about adapting these activities for people with dementia. And here's just another example of how we did this with taking out the garbage. So again, you'll get the idea that it's just this kind of staged approach, picking up the activities that people would normally always do, but modifying them in such a way that they can always be engaged and always be involved. So this notion of, and another video link that you'll have on here, we won't probably have time to watch it, so I'm just going to leave it in the things for you to watch afterwards. But one of the things that can be really frustrating are these repetitive question behaviors that people with dementia sometimes engage in. And this video is a lovely video from, again, the UC, there's a collective of videos through the UCLA dementia clinic that this video will take you to. They cover a whole host of issues from sundowning to repetitive question asking. So again, I've tried to give you resources that you can spend some time with. But this repetitive question asking behavior, one of the things that we try to just one of the kind of best strategies for turning this away is to give people a visual schedule, right? So you write down on the wall everything that's going to happen that day. And when they ask you the question over and over again, you simply tell them, go check your schedule. Now it takes a while to get this habit in place, but when you do that, what you'll see is that people will go start the repetitive question asking cycle, and they'll take themselves to their own board to check. It takes several tries to get this down pat, but if you're consistent with it, it does work. The thing to remember here is that the repetitive question asking behaviors are not a memory problem. They're an indication of anxiety and distress. So it's an indication that the person with dementia feels unsettled, and that information seeking behavior is actually to meet an emotional need, not a misremembering need. And so that's where having things up like a dry erase board that has the daily schedule, or has, you know, a note even on the door that says your daughter will be here at 6 o'clock, whatever it is, when you can get them into the procedural memory or the habit of going to go check that, the reading of that brings them comfort. The checking of the schedule brings them comfort. The person who kind of keeps telling you the same thing over and over again, much like me tonight, one of the best things that you can do in that context is just say, tell me more. There's not a need to correct. There's not a need to reorient to time. There's not a need to make sure they've got it right. There's not even a need to say, you've already told me that 32 times today. Just tell me more. But typically that person will say is, and I had a very nice day, and they'll just go on. Right. But if you sit and argue with them around how you've already told me that 32 times today, and they say, no, I didn't, then you're just kind of perpetuating that cycle. Right. So a really simple technique is just to say, tell me more.
And you're straining
That's
the
it.
connection.
Yeah. And you're straining the connection. Right. You're pulling away the emotional connection and making that person feel disrespected. Right. So I can promise you, if you'll try, tell me more. That's interesting. I'd love to know more about that. It'll start that conversation. And in doing so, respect someone's dignity. Right. Yeah, we can skip over this. This was an example of a visual schedule, but you'll see when in the video link that I provided to you. Okay, you can go ahead. So we're going to talk a little bit. Thanks. We're going to talk a little bit about communication strategies. This slide actually made a little bit more sense with the images that were there, but it's basically to say there's a lot of different variants of dementia, and they each have different profiles, right? You can go ahead. So people with dementia can have memory issues. That's what we're all familiar with. And that can be memory for everyday events, or that can be something we call working memory, which is super important. It's what you hold in your mind while you're doing other things. It lets you kind of manipulate the world around you. And working memory is really important for putting words into sentences, for example, because if you can't hold them active in memory, you can't drop them into a sentence. And so that's a really important part for language. It's what also lets us do more than one thing at a time. And so then we see people have trouble with that. Dementias can also affect your ability to understand, not just your ability to produce language. And some dementias can actually cause problems with speech, right? So not just getting the words out, but actually being able to shape the speech sounds, or it might make speech sound more slurred. So the point is that there's just a whole lot of different symptoms that we can expect to see in people who have dementia. While they're slightly different for all of the dementia types, almost always within about 5 to 7 years of diagnosis, they all kind of start to look the same. So even people with Alzheimer's disease, which is a primary memory dementia, can develop some speech changes as their disease progresses. One of the other important things to remember, San's picture here, is that dementias can also affect how people process emotions and how they generate emotions. And this isn't just kind of if you've ever been around someone with dementia, you kind of see that masked look they get on their face. It's like the emotions just aren't as vivid. It's not a motor problem with their face. It actually is that the region of the brain that's used to generate those emotions becomes impaired. And hearing loss is something else that we have to think about. So hearing loss is common in aging, but it's actually much more common in people who have dementia. And we don't know why. So people with dementia are at a higher risk of developing hearing loss, but interestingly, we actually think hearing loss itself contributes to the development of dementia. And we don't know why. This is a big mystery, and we and others have some studies in this space where we're trying to figure it out. But in and of itself, hearing loss can affect people who have dementia, or hearing loss can affect communication. You layer that on top of the dementia, it can really become more complicated. And so here are some of the challenges that people can see in conversation. So you can have longer pauses, or people might be slower to process information. Some people with dementia might not always use the correct word. And the most frustrating thing is really this limited topics, right? And repetitive question asking, things that we try to address in the last little unit. So I'll give just a few tips here, and these are pretty, they're kind of our top 10 list of how to help communication challenges. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but again, you'll have all of them. I'm going to send this slide. I'll send them to you tomorrow as a PDF, and you can just send them out to everybody that you want. So one of the things to remember is start one topic at a time. Don't jump all around. Finish one topic before you move to the next. Now, this is really hard if you're one of those people whose brains bounces around all the time, or if you're a caregiver who just has a lot on your mind all the time, but you kind of have to remember one topic at a time. Make sure that you let your partner know that you're paying attention. When they're talking to you, nod, say, uh-huh. They need that extra feedback to know that what they're saying, you're actually registering. And you want to make sure that you're listening actively and being patient. You want to provide lots of extra time. So make sure that you give people extra time to process information and extra time to get out what they want to say. This means conversations do not happen in a hurry. This will, I think, make a lot more sense when the picture is there, but I'll send that out tomorrow. But it's that notion of thinking about using multiple ways to get information in pictures and written word, as well as what you're saying. This will also make more sense with the picture on it. Keywording is similar to what I was talking to you about earlier, where you might write down keywords as you're talking so the person with dementia can follow what you're saying. This is where the Sharpies and the dry erase markers come into handy. So if I'm saying we're going to have a party tonight, I might write party. We're going to do a cheese plate. I'd write cheese plate. Do you want Stilton or cheddar? And then actually let them circle the choice that they want. And that can all be done as you're getting ready to go grocery shopping so that person can engage with you in the grocery shopping process. We generally want to reduce the complexity of sentences, and you want to offer yes/no questions when you have the choice. Yes/no questions are much easier for people with dementia to process, especially in the middle and the late stages. Sorry. Actions can always speak louder than words, and that means you want to communicate with your whole body. Make sure your face aligns with what you have to say. Go ahead. And you can skip past this one. Okay. And then just being mindful here of time, I'm going to slide through these last few. So in terms of what to do, because conversations will always break down, right? Something's not going to be clear and something's going to fall apart. When it does, you just want to constantly monitor for people's facial expressions, something that's very hard these days with our masks on. Yeah. But you have to watch people's eyes and make sure. This has been a really challenging time actually for people with dementia, because it makes it even harder for them to communicate. It makes them feel more isolated. But you want to watch for slowing response time or facial expressions that say that they didn't understand. You want to monitor that the whole time. And even in the early stages of dementia, it's okay to restate, did I understand you correctly? You want Stilton cheese tonight. If you don't feel like you understand, then just directly ask for help. Right? I don't think I understood that last word. Can you say that again? Right? And this is a good reliever for people with dementia with their partners. Go ahead. When things break down, you want to repeat what you said. You can rephrase and add more information, but when I say repeat, I mean actually repeat. You don't have to get fancy the second time around. If someone says, I didn't understand you, or they look at you as if they didn't understand you, just simply repeat it exactly as you said it. If you need to, you can simplify it. You can use gestures, pictures, or objects to reinforce what you said, but above all else, stay calm. It's one of the hardest things. Go ahead. Never raise your voice. Yeah. So why not raise your voice? Why do you think it's not a great idea to raise your voice?
You get into a voice raising contest. I can raise my voice higher than you can, and if you want to try it, if you want to fight about it, let's go. Exactly,
and it's that fight about it, let's go, that happens more often than not, right? And when we raise our voice, it makes our face look stern. People interpret us as being angry. And the emotional intent is, I'm not happy with you. And so it does just that. It starts a fight response. One of the greatest reasons why you'll see needs-driven behaviors is this kind of raising voice. So you're exactly right. You can go on. And then one of the things we try to encourage people to do is to respond to the messages and not to the words. Words can always be in error, but pay attention to the message and the emotions. And this is a whole, you'll get this, but it's just a whole list of videos that include activity sheets for doing activities at home, education series, and then this last bullet point are three excellent videos on helping with memory and communication problems at home. Okay. And you can skip past this. Okay, and I'm going to spend 2 minutes on this because I know we're almost out of time. And I want to emphasize that talk a little bit about what I think the role of the church is here. And we've done some of this work in my own parish. So I'm a member of St. David's in Glenview, and we've done some of this work there. So I can spend a little bit here encouraging you to think about how the church becomes this larger caregiving network. And so you can just hit one more slide. Yeah. So there you go. So one of the things that we think about the church doing is helping to build capacity in caregiving. So this means training even the youth in your church to be good neighbors, to help do yard cleanup, to help do shopping, to do any aspects of respite care. I actually think these intergenerational ministries are really important because you can work with the youth to learn how to connect and understand the stories of those in our church who have been the pillars. And I think it gives them important skills. And so I think building up these programs that allow for short respite periods for caregivers to just go get their hair cut or to take a walk or to have some time to themselves is really important. Some churches, and the picture here is missing, but there's a wonderful church in Montgomery, Alabama. I'll send you the resource for this. That has actually created a whole respite care program in their church, where they offer 1 day a week of dementia care programming so that caregivers can get out and run errands and have some time to themselves. There you go. You can keep going. There's also opportunities in the church for people with cognitive impairment to contribute. And I think this is super important, whether it's folding bulletins, whether it's putting hymnals back after church. But people with dementia want to feel like they're still a part of their community, not pushed to the outside. And I think every church, every church has a real, you can pass by this one. You can keep going. It's without the pictures, it's a little bit hard, but every church has the opportunity to tap into these, helping people these meaningful experiences. And I'll stop on this slide, but one of the things that I want to highlight is that worship services offer an extremely valuable opportunity for normalcy. They are a place where care partners can take someone with dementia and the memories of having been through the same type of service for 15, 20 years actually kick in, right? They're familiar, they're routines. And it gives an opportunity for people with dementia and their partners to have that hour-long church service where all of a sudden that person sitting beside you just feels like your spouse or your family member. It's an incredibly important time. You can create opportunities through accessible hymnals, just even having the song words printed out on a page or having the pages marked in a hymnal, but thinking about ways that you can make the church accessible to people who have dementia. If there are people who have more wandering issues, so they might tend to wander during the service, you can create a quiet area in the chapel or in the church where people are able to do that without disrupting others. But even then, it's just educating the church that these are just behaviors, right? They're just part of who this person is now and creating acceptance. So I challenge, I think, all of you. So thank you for your time tonight. But I also challenge each of you to kind of be thinking about how as a church, you can kind of pull this kind of accessible environment together for people with dementia.
Any responses, questions for Angela? By the way, Angela, that was, you bring not only knowledge, but heart and compassion.
Yeah.
This comes through very
Personal
clearly.
experience.
Thank you very much.
Personal experience, not just academic knowledge.
Well, you guys were
really
great.
lovely.
There were two things that hit me immediately. And I have a husband with dementia who's in a care facility, as everybody here knows. One of them was, oh gosh, what was the word you used? I can't remember anything here. Creative lying.
Yeah, creative lying.
I don't know that was quite the word.
But it is.
My husband and I never lie, but now I have to do that sometimes, and that's really hard for me. So I like the way that you put it as sort of therapeutic lying. I think
Yes,
that's
that
what you
was
use.
it.
Yeah,
That was
therapeutic
it.
lying. Yes.
It's nicer than saying creative lying, but it is the same thing, right? And I think it gets to the importance of meeting people where they are right now today, in this minute, in this moment, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of families I work with have trouble with this construct of lying because of just the honesty that's required in a marriage. It's honesty is paramount in my own marriage. But it is important to think about perhaps not as lying, but meeting people just where they are in this moment right now. And that's all you're doing. You're meeting your partner in the moment of just where they are.
That's right. You take them where they are rather than whatever. And then don't get angry. That's another one. Sometimes
much easier
like
to say
that.
than to do. Yeah, and the anger comes from a grief.
well, it's from
Right.
frustration.
Yeah,
Frustration. Yes.
Yeah.
It's all of that.
I'd like to make sure folks at home or wherever you are have a chance to ask any questions you might like to ask Angela or make any comments. Just unmute yourself and speak, please.
So the anger, you're exactly right. It comes from a place of grief, a place of frustration, a place of loss, you know, and you know, I can say it, I do know firsthand it's much easier to say than to do, but I also find personally that if I'm meeting my loved one in the moment where they are right now, the anger doesn't come so easily. You know, if I keep myself present in the absolute moment, no matter what that is, then I'm not holding them accountable for who they've been or what I wish they still were or where I wish we were. It allows me in that presence to just be and allows them to just be. And in that moment, the anger comes less easily for me.
And I also appreciated, I will go in and I'll have news of the family. None of our family live nearby.
Yeah.
And I'll have this and that and so forth. And I'll say, when I want to tell you about this, this and this, thank you. It's one at a time.
Yeah.
Let's get through that. Let's rest a bit. And we'll get into the next topic.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges I find myself is trying to slow down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
it's
trying
not
to
easy,
slow
but-
down and trying to figure out what the other person needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what the other person is capable of and not capable of, and how much do you try to help, or you stand back and let the person struggle.
Yeah, I think some of that is in that negotiating preferences space. And when you start that early on in your dementia journey, right, especially when someone's first diagnosed, if you start that early on, that habit early on in your dementia journey, where you are negotiating preferences at kind of multiple points, it just becomes habit, right? But it's okay, I think, in that moment of, just to ask, you know, how much help do you need, right? When do you want me to jump in? And sometimes if the person is still able to have that negotiation with you, you can do that. It's not fixed, right? We're going to dinner at the Smith's house tonight. How are you feeling tonight? How much help would you like to have? Would you like to have a quiet night? Would you like to talk more tonight? What are you feeling, right? But I think having that conversation before you go out is about truly building a partnership. The two of you walking through this dementia journey together.
That's
No.
what it is.
It's exactly what it is, right? And it's going to change from day to day. It's going to change from event to event. But I think in all the examples I've tried to point out from, either things we've done in our own work or in my own personal experiences, it's about recognizing and acknowledging that person's expertise and still to have agency in their life, right? And that changes over the journey. There will come a time where you are making almost all the decisions, right? The person with dementia is not able to contribute to their decisions as much anymore. But that doesn't stop our ability to reach out and say, honey, I'm going to get an estimate on the roof today, right? Or honey, we've got 3 bids back. One of them's 20,000, one of them's 15,000. But I'm going to go with the 20,000 one because I think that's the best company. Right? Even though that person may not be contributing to the decisions, even though they may not be following all of what you're saying, that touch on the arm and that conversational pattern is about validating that they're still a part of life.
Still the engagement.
Right? It's still the engagement. And that's the part that gets harder and harder. As caregivers, you have to begin to kind of train and shape yourself for the fact that the expectation of the response is different. Right? You're not going to get that person on the other side who's shaking their head or giving you any advice. That's the hard part as a care partner, right? To lose that piece.
It's the loss.
It's the loss.
The
right?
loss in the relationship.
But you might be surprised if we adjust our expectations and we still have some of those conversations, you might be surprised just how much engagement is there. And I'll tell you briefly, and I know we're at time. A couple we were working with, when they first came to see us, she would come in and stare at the table the whole time, never looked up, never engaged. He'd bring her in, her head was down, he would take her coat off, he'd put her in the chair, when they got ready to go, he'd put her coat on and they would. She never looked up. He was there to learn communication strategies because he had just lost his partner completely. We started creating some of these activity boxes. We started teaching him how to stop testing her so much, to really just start incorporating her into the everyday activities, even if he had to take her in and put her down. Even if it was using a template at the table for a plate, but just having her take the plate and put it on the circle, right on the table. He followed everything just the way we asked him. He struggled, especially the test taking part. Getting him to stop that was really hard because he thought every time he was going through the family picture up and saying, who is this, who is this, who is this, who is this, that he was helping her to stay better. And we had to tell him he was not. But within about 8 to 12 weeks of them trying to make these changes at home, she comes in one day, her head is up. She helped take her coat off. And we were just about ready to discharge them from care. She started pulling items out of her box and just putting them on the table to initiate conversation. She had still not said anything, but as she left that day, she reached out and touched my hand and said, like this. Right? It's patience, because these things don't take hold overnight. But his ability to change how he interacted, we did nothing, right? He did all of the changing, but his ability to change how he interacted with her at home. Nothing changed about her dementia. She did not get better. But what she did was have a restoration of her dignity and her identity and her desire and her ability to be in the moment of where she was, right? All because he changed how he communicated with her. We did nothing. So these things they take patience and time and investment and hard work, and it's not an overnight payoff. But he adjusted his expectations, and then all of a sudden she came out, right? And those are the important things for us to remember. It's not just about what the dementia is doing, it's what it's also doing to us as a unit, and our own behavior changes are actually affecting that person as well. It goes back to that ecosystem model. So we want to change, we have to change, right? But it's really hard to do, and it takes a lot of patience. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's quick or easy. It's not.
Patience is a virtue.
Patience is a virtue.
Patience is a virtue.
Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Evening. appreciate incorporating the importance of the congregation.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's really
There
great.
are fewer and fewer institutions in our society where people can actually get to know unrelated
Mhm.
families, and not only get to know them, but offer kindness, support,
Mhm.
listen to one another. So the role of the congregation in dementia care, I think, is very critical.
I agree.
Well, thank you all for being here.
That's
Have a
great.
wonderful evening, everybody.
Take
And we will
care.
get the